Really quick. So I just wanted to say welcome to everyone who's joining us for our first webinar in the virtual Historic Preservation Conference series. So this webinar is entitled Disappearing Places, Taverns, Tanneries, Churches, Mail Pouch Tobacco Barn Signs, and Greenbrier County's Hidden History Project. So we'll be doing 4 presentations throughout this webinar today. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Danielle Parker, and I am the Executive Director for the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia. So it's great to have you all join us today. So I'll be passing it over to our first speaker, Sandra Scafidi, who is with Practical Preservation.
Thank you, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. And my presentation is just about what I discovered working on a little essay on historic taverns in West Virginia prior to 1815. These buildings were more than just places to drink. They served as inns, courts, post offices, meeting places, centers of trade and communication, especially on the frontier. Throughout this presentation, we'll look at how taverns operated, how to identify them through their architecture, and how we can use documentary evidence to identify and document these buildings before they disappear from the landscape. Next slide, please. As you all know, West Virginia didn't get the nickname Wild and Wonderful for nothing. Travel back in the 18th and 19th centuries through Western Virginia was slow, difficult, and often dangerous. Early roads and muddy wagon paths allowed travelers to only average about 10 miles a day. And because of this, taverns emerged along major routes to provide food, lodging, and often care for horses. This map shows some of the taverns we discovered through our research. It's definitely not exhaustive, but if you know of any others, I'd love to hear about them, and we can continue to add to this map. Next slide, please. And throughout this discussion, I'll use the terms taverns, ordinaries, and public houses interchangeably. And I will often probably switch between Western Virginia and Virginia accidentally. So apologies in advance. But before taverns became formally regulated, homeowners often provided travelers with meals and warm shelter in exchange for payment. As settlement increased, these informal arrangements evolved into licensed businesses. In the late 18th and by the late 18th century, tavern keepers in Virginia were often required to obtain licenses from the county court. Applicants posted bonds, secured recommendations, and agreed not to encourage gambling or disorderly conduct. The licenses themselves were brief and formulaic. Selling alcohol without a license could result in serious penalties, including jail time. This slide depicts the home of Walter Newman, who operated a tavern in Point Pleasant. As you can see, his license award from 1801 was brief and to the point. I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says, "On the motion of Walter Newman, it is ordered that he be permitted to keep an ordinary at his house in Point Pleasant upon entering into bond and security in the clerk's office within 1 month." And so these are the kind of records we're looking for when we're trying to identify these historic tavern sites. Next slide, please. Throughout Western Virginia, the county courts regulated tavern prices with fees established for liquor, meals, lodging, horse care. It's usually in pounds and cents. Pounds, shillings, and pence. Early tavern keepers also charged additional fees for clean sheets, warm meals, feed, or pasture for their horses. Rates were to be posted publicly inside the tavern, not more than 6 feet above the floor. This example from Monroe County in 1799 was published in an early county history, although fee schedules similarly appeared throughout early county records. And not surprisingly, these records tended to increase every year. As travel increased, taverns began serving different types of customers. Some simply offered private homes offering shelter, while others catered to drovers moving livestock, wealthy travelers seeking refined accommodations, or courthouse visitors in county seats. And although many of these facilities' functions overlap, taverns often developed reputations tied to a particular kind of clientele. And conditions vary dramatically. Some travelers described filthy log cabins filled with insects where guests cooked their own meals and cared for their own horses. Others stayed in more substantial establishments that offered them prepared meals, clean bedding, and stabling. Next slide, please. Simple buildings like Stewart's Tavern in Mineral County was an especially convenient location for travelers because of its location near travel routes and also near the services such as a grist mill. This building helps visitors envision what life was like on the frontier in the late 18th century. Refined travelers, however, desired a higher class of lodging. As the town of Bath evolved into a resort destination, taverns like the Sign of the Swan offered ladies and gentlemen what appeared in newspapers as genteel boarding. Guests could enjoy tea service, entertainment, billiards, and separate lodging rooms. Since I didn't find a good picture of a historic tavern in Bath, I included a picture of my niece dancing in Bath, England instead. In Western Virginia, as the communities became more populated, taverns also became important community institutions. They functioned as gathering places, trading centers, post offices, election sites, and locations for the tax collection and court. People exchanged information, conducted business, held meetings, and sometimes even searched for lost property there. In many communities, taverns also served as the social and economic center of life. And although taverns were usually operated by men with the assistance of wives, daughters, or enslaved or indentured servants, there were instances where widowed women occasionally operated taverns. Mary Catherine Weltzheimer in Shepherdstown was perhaps the most successful female tavern keeper in Western Virginia, although women such as Sarah Stockton in Martinsburg, Rebecca McSherry in Romney, and Hetty Updegraff in Moorfield also managed taverns successfully. Like male tavern keepers, they were required to demonstrate good character as well as follow county regulations regarding prices and alcohol sales. These women kept their families stable while also providing an important community service. Now, architecturally, early taverns in West Virginia looked very similar to any ordinary home. Most were located near well-traveled roads. The earliest examples were usually just simple 1 or 2 story log buildings with a central hearth and a sleeping loft. Many later received additions or exterior siding as they evolved over time. As settlements expanded and communities became more prosperous, larger taverns appeared, sometimes constructed of brick or stone. Smith's Tavern in Middleway, for example, on the upper left corner of the slide, was recognizable for its massive stone chimney. Buildings like the Parker Tavern in Romney, however, featured often multiple chimneys to heat several rooms, along with a shed-roofed porch that extended public and commercial space. Outbuildings for these taverns often included kitchens, stables, and workshops. Furnishings also varied widely. Some taverns contained only simple rustic benches and tables, while more refined establishments offered imported furniture, clean linens, and private lodging rooms. Meals were often served communally, and liquor was sometimes stored in a locked cabinet. The challenge, of course, is that many of these features were also common in ordinary houses. Because of that, architectural evidence alone is usually not enough. Documentary evidence is often what confirms a building's historic use as an inn. And the best place to begin identifying taverns is usually in the early county records. Depending on the county, they may appear in minute books, court order books, or even deed books. Regardless, if someone applied for a tavern license in or before 1815, there's a good chance that that record survives in the early records. Unfortunately, though, as you can see with this slide, these records are not the easiest to read. However, they generally follow the same format. Excuse me. And I've been fortunate that WVU has had many early records digitized on microfilm. And then other websites now, like Family Search, have these microfilm digitized, and now you can do keyword searches, which makes the process much easier. It's not perfect, but it's very helpful. And for example, here's a record, typical record from 1795 in Monongalia County. But if you zoom in on the next slide, you'll see that the complaint against a tavern keeper who was accused of allowing gambling in his facility. Records like this help us understand not only where taverns existed, but also how they were regulated and monitored by the courts. Historic tax records also help determine if a building was being used as a tavern. Next slide, please. Historic newspapers are another incredibly useful source. Many early newspapers have been microfilmed or digitized, and the Library of Congress website was especially helpful. Again, they have keyword searching. The WVU and West Virginia Archives also has access to regional collections. So I really feel like I have to say we are so lucky about what we do have in terms of our research facilities. But these newspapers, they provided advertisements, court notices, travel announcements. And again, these are all just helping to identify taverns and their owners and give us a trail to follow. I was also very lucky to find historic photographs, which documented many taverns, excuse me, before they disappeared. A historian named Innes Davis documented many taverns in the 1960s. Her collection at WVU gave me a great starting point for identifying lost buildings and comparing them to surviving structures. And of course, historic maps are another great resource in locating taverns. Many early map makers marked the location of important sites, including churches, sawmills, ferries, and taverns. Local archives and historical societies, excuse me, are especially useful for locating these materials. This map I found from the Library of Congress. It uses a key identifying the locations of taverns and other important buildings. And we just outlined the West Virginia counties in red just to make them easier to see. Travel diaries also provided another important perspective. Visitors traveling through Western Virginia often recorded their impressions of the landscape, roads, taverns, and local people. Even when they don't identify a building by name, they give us firsthand descriptions of their travels through the area. And surviving tavern account books reveal daily life in remarkable detail, documenting food, alcohol, labor, furniture, and even books loaned to neighbors. This record, more than any other, helped explain the tavern's role as a hub of a local barter-based economy. But even with documentary evidence, identifying taverns is not always straightforward. This is the Old Stone Tavern in Moorfield, which gave me a particularly difficult time. Aside from its name, I couldn't find any correlation between the landowners and the tavern licenses. However, it very well could have just been a rental tavern. So I really need to do more research to determine the history of this building. But it's a great building. But why are these taverns vanishing from the landscape? Taverns began falling out of popularity in the late 19th century as steamships, railroads, and improved transportation changed travel patterns. And it negated the need for taverns constructed every 10 to 15 miles. The term tavern also began to receive a negative connotation based on class, the temperance movement, and also the changing economy. Many buildings were altered, demolished, or simply forgotten. And because early taverns also resembled ordinary houses, many surviving examples remain unidentified today. Documenting these places matters because taverns were essential to the settlement and development of early West Virginia. And once they disappear, the stories that connect them often disappear as well. And I'll leave you one final recipe for a beverage called Bumbo, which was served at Peter Steenbergen's Tavern. And I haven't tried it yet, but I'm assuming it's very tasty. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you. That was great, Sandra. I'm going to switch to our next presentation here. If you guys just give me a moment, and we are going to be taking questions at the end, but if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Sandra, you can put those in the chat. Okay, so next here we will be going to David Abruzzi's presentation here. So let me just share my screen again, guys. Okay, take it away, David.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So this was a little bit outside my comfort zone as I'm a architect by training, and there's very little architecture or history standing of tanneries. So it kind of put me in a different position, which is probably good to branch out a little bit. So next slide, please. Uh, So most people know about West Virginia company, coal towns, and lumber companies and their role in the economy, development, and use of natural resources. But coal and lumber were not the only natural resource intensive industries operating in the state. Slide, please. While tanneries in places like Moorfield and Petersburg carried on into the 1970s, and the tannery at Frank and Pocahontas County continued producing shoe leather until 1994, the age of large-scale leather tanning in West Virginia effectively ended in the 1950s when the largest tannery owned by the United States Leather Company quit operations in Paw Paw in December 1951. Next slide, please. Vegetable tanning was an incredibly resource-intensive industry, but West Virginia was endowed with the necessary resources to position it perfectly and, dare I say, exploited to make tanneries successful here. There was an increasingly plentiful supply of animal hides available by rail from Chicago, and from Chicago, railroads connected to population and industrial centers to the east. The forests of West Virginia provided a ready source of tan bark, and with oak being one of the tree species with a high percentage of tannins, the West Virginia forests were perfect. A rough rule of thumb was each hide required several trees worth of bark. Water was needed for the tanning process, and in some cases for power. West Virginia had plenty of limestones for making lime. Forests, spent tan bark, typically provided the fuel required to heat the vats to the proper temperature for liming and tanning. Labor. West Virginia provided a ready source of men for labor who in many cases lacked other options. In Paw Paw, the largest employer was the tannery. To understand West Virginia's tanning industry, we need to look at New York first. Slide, please. The earliest commercial tanneries in the United States began operating around 1790 along the Hudson River on the southern tip of Manhattan. The tanneries mostly processed hides shipped to New York by sea from the West Indies and Central and South America. The tanneries used primarily oak bark since forests of oak were plentiful in the area. The growth in the city's population and the deforestation coincided with the discovery in the United Kingdom in 1805 that hemlock bark could be readily substituted for oak bark in the tanning process. The slopes of the Catskills were covered in millions of hemlock trees, and the Catskills offered plentiful water for the tanning process and the navigable Hudson for shipping finished hides to market. The first tanneries opened in the Catskills in 1817, with the industry peaking in the area less than 30 years later. At its peak, 64 tanneries operated in the region and used up to 70 million hemlock trees in their tanning process. The rapid deforestation of the Catskills, coupled with the growth of railroads in the 1850s and 1860s, led major tannery companies, still headquartered in New York City, to seek out more financially advantageous locations. The consolidation of individual stockyards outside Chicago into the Union Stockyards in 1865 offered a more readily available source of cowhides over sources that had been shipped from overseas locations. These changes made West Virginia an ideal place to open new tanneries. Slide, please. West Virginia, after the Civil War, was perfectly situated to become a center of the tanning industry. The state offered vast tracts of tanbark forests, plentiful water, several navigable rivers, and rail. The B&O Railroad offered a connection from the Midwest to Baltimore and its port, as well as connections to rail lines up and down the East Coast. West Virginia's eastern and northern panhandles provided the primary rail route for the B&O linking Baltimore and Chicago. West Virginia's mountainous landscape limited industrial development, and the terrain also could not really support large agriculture operations. These factors left a large segment of the population seeking steady work, which the labor-intensive tannery industry offered. Tanneries provided consistent work and much-needed seasonal income to the farmers who peeled bark from trees in their woodlands. Slide, please. The Center Wheeling Tannery was founded in 1849 when Wheeling's population stood at around 11,000. The tannery's location was strategic, given the city of Wheeling was the terminus of both the B&O Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad systems on the east side of the Ohio River. Next slide, please. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, acquisition and consolidation of tanneries played out across West Virginia. The largest leather company in the United States was the U.S. Leather Company, which began operations in 1893 and had several tanneries in West Virginia, the largest being in Paw Paw. It is estimated the United States Leather Company, in its heyday, was the largest company in the United States and rivaled both the Dutch East India and British East India companies for that distinction at the international level. The company was one of the original 12 companies listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1986 and 1896, and had the unfortunate distinction of being the first and only original company to have completely disappeared. The United States Leather Company, often during the time called the Leather Combine or Leather Trust, was established by the owners of 200 tanneries who combined them into one entity to seek better prices from the Union Stockyard. It also obtained ownership and access to 75% of the bark property. Next slide, please. So now let's shift the story to Paw Paw and its tannery. In 1868, the Hoyt brothers from New York opened a tannery in Paw Paw. The Paw Paw location was likely selected because of its location on a large flat parcel of land on the banks of the Potomac River, adjacent to the B&O Railroad main line and the C&O Canal directly across the river, and for the abundance of oak forests growing in the immediate area on both sides of the Potomac River. Next, please. The town of Paw Paw has a significant Black history that is worth touching on. While there's no documentation to verify why Black families settled in Paw Paw after the Civil War, my thesis is it can be at least partially attributed to the tannery and its owners. Being from New York, it is likely they did not carry the same prejudice that was prevalent further south, so they offered employment to both white and Black. Couple the opportunity for employment with the chance to educate your children. In the early 1870s, the tannery provided a schoolhouse to educate Black students under West Virginia's segregated education system. Paw Paw likely was seen as a good place to live for African Americans after the Civil War. Slide, please. This photo shows the row of tanning vats open to the elements after a 1930 fire that destroyed 40% of the tannery. Prior to the fire, these all would have been inside the tannery building, and stories of fire and flooding pretty much prevails across West Virginia tanneries. Slide, please. In 1930, radio personality Lowell Thomas presented 17 Years Under the Sea on his radio broadcast. The story was about the recovery of cargo from a ship sunk carrying belt leather from the Paw Paw Tannery 17 years earlier. The leather was reported to still be as supple and fine as the day it left the tannery, despite being exposed to seawater for all those years. By the 1930s, it was said the tannery was producing more than 500 hides daily and employed more than 200 men. This made it the largest producer of industrial belt leather in the world. Slide, please. In 1936, the St. Patrick's Day flood inundated low-lying areas of the Potomac River. At Paw Paw, the Potomac River crested at 54 feet, which was 26 feet above normal flood stage, flooding the tannery and much of the town. Slide. Like many other tanneries, the Paw Paw Tannery did provide housing for some tannery employers. This photo shows the tannery superintendent's house along a sliver of land between the original B&O main line and a spur serving the tannery. In the background, you can see the tan bark sheds. The smaller photo shows the same spot today. The house in the photo would have been behind the superintendent's house in the large photo. Slide, please. This photo shows one of the 5 new duplexes built on tannery property following the flood of 1936. Next to it, one of the original tannery houses that was damaged in the flood before being demolished. The smaller photo shows 3 of the homes today. The earlier house would have stood between 2 of the duplexes. Slide, please. In 1939, United States Leather moved a stamping operation from New Jersey to Paw Paw to establish a cut-sole shoe factory in the town. Slide. The increase in tannery operations drove the need for more housing. These three homes, which, while not built by the tannery, were constructed specifically by Paw Paw resident E.C. Ambrose, a former superintendent of the United States Leather Company for tannery management in the town. Slide, please. Despite the opening of the New Cut Sole factory in 1939, the tannery shut down its operations just 12 years later in December 1951. The shutdown is attributed by some to be the result of a decision by local workers to unionize. However, I do not believe it is that simple. West Virginia tanneries began to disappear in the 20th century as deforestation depleted local tanbark supplies. Demand for harness leather diminished as automobiles took over the roads. Large belt-driven factory equipment was being replaced with more modern machines, negating the need for belt leather, and synthetics, such as synthetic rubber, cut into the market for sole leather. Following the tannery's closure, the property was used by Avon Products, Ray Gold Industries, and Vesuvius Crucible before eventually being abandoned following the Election Day flood of 1985. There were rumors of Anheuser-Busch looking to construct a brewery on the old tannery property, but if true, it never materialized. The last major vestige of the plant left standing was the water tower that remained as an iconic landmark until it too was demolished on October 1st, 2011. Given the change to synthetics and the move towards motorized transportation, there was no real way for the tanbark tanneries could compete on or pivot to address the changes. Slide, please. So tanneries played a major role. Not much really could be done given the change of the world economics and moving to synthetics. And one last slide again to cover what I've discovered as far as tanneries in West Virginia. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, so again, if you have questions, we're going to hold those to the end, but you can feel free to pop some in the chat in case you think you might forget. And I'm going to switch the presentations here. Our next presentation will be with Cody Straley about churches. So I think I've got that all set up there. So go ahead, Cody, take it away.
Yeah, looks good. Hello, I'm Cody Straley. I'm the National Register Coordinator for the West Virginia State Historic Preservation Office. Here we're going to discuss some churches. Next to houses and commercial properties, churches are probably the most prolific resource we have in West Virginia, and likewise also one of the most threatened resources in the state. So next slide, please. So a survey in the early 2000s estimated that there is about over 4,000 churches and other religious facilities in West Virginia. It didn't distinguish between whether or not the churches were active or inactive, but the number sounds fairly accurate. Historically, the majority of churches in the state have been Baptist, Methodist, or Presbyterians, but there is a rich diversity of different denominations around the state. Catholic, Orthodoxy, Church of Christ, Episcopalian, various different churches depending on community demographics. But churches in the state have come in various shapes and sizes, ranging from the small one-room wood frame buildings up on remote hillsides to the big, elaborate stone and brick Gothic Revival buildings in the more urban areas. Their size and designs often reflects the kind of culture, available resources, and the socioeconomic conditions of the particular community. Churches were historically a very important community asset for these groups. They were centers of spiritual and social life for the people who were members. They were the sites of weddings, funerals, baptisms, in some cases burials. And in more secular aspects, they also hosted lots of meetings, reunions, dinners, and even sometimes classes before a school building was built in an area. Sometimes they would utilize a church to have classes. The next slide, please. Threats. There is a laundry list of threats to church buildings today. Probably the biggest is economic and demographic decline. Our state population has been shrinking for several decades now. And those who do remain, there's fewer people who maintain active church attendance. So, all of that means there are smaller congregations and less money to go around to maintain buildings. And churches are pretty expensive to maintain, especially the much bigger brick and stone buildings. That's a constant concern for these churches is how to keep the buildings from falling apart. In many cases, they're unable to do that. Other threats are lack of sustained community interest and viable preservation plans. Um, if the congregation is small or non-existent and people in the area don't care about the church, um, then you have a harder time preserving the building. You need people there who are invested in maintaining the property and doing something productive with it. Um, And as for viable preservation plans, it is challenging finding realistic uses for church buildings once they're no longer churches. You can always try and plant a new church in a building, but given the way the demographics are going in the state, that might not be viable for every building out there. And it's hard to maintain the character of a church um, and turn it into something more useful. Because you just have that big open space inside a church. We really want you to maintain that if possible, to maintain the historic character of the building, and that's hard to accomplish. Some churches have been turned into like restaurants, cafes, occasionally housing, but it's still a challenge figuring out what's the most appropriate reuse of these old buildings. Rehabilitation costs are also very prohibitive in many cases, especially for the bigger churches. Sometimes the total cost of repairing them and adapting them can be in the millions, even, often beyond what most communities can afford. So, what are the consequences of some of these challenges? A lot of churches are closed and left abandoned, and there's no one around to take care of them. Demolition by neglect often follows. The building deteriorates to the point where restoring it is no longer feasible and it has to be demolished for public safety. Urban renewal has been a threat too at times. A lot of communities or private stakeholders will tear down churches to make room for new buildings or parking lots to quote unquote improve the community. Vandalism is always a threat, both in urban and rural churches. People break in and either deliberately or accidentally cause damage to these buildings. As far as we can tell, at least 4 churches that are on the National Register, or on the National Register in the state, have been lost through these different actions. Which is a reminder that just because a property is on the National Register doesn't guarantee it will be preserved. Listing does not prevent a building from being demolished, and churches are not immune to that problem. Next slide, please. A couple case studies of the challenges facing churches. One here is the First Baptist Church of Bluefield in Mercer County. It's a gorgeous early 1900s eclectic style building, massive with a nice octagonal shaped sanctuary. It was put on the National Register in 2023. It's been vacant for a couple decades now and has deteriorated rapidly. It needs a new roof, among other things. And there were plans a couple years ago to rehabilitate it, possibly into a small brewery and culinary school, make it something productive for the area. But the cost of repairing the building proved much higher than the parties involved expected. This is will probably cost a few $1 million at least to fix it up, make it safe for public use. So the current plan for the city is to demolish the church. As far as I know, it's still standing, but demolition could come at any time now, regrettably. And they want to, I think, build single-family housing units on the property, but don't quote me on that. Yeah, next slide. And then vandalism is another big problem. This is or was the St. Coleman's rather, Roman Catholic Church and Cemetery. It was a small wood frame church up on a hill in a very rural area. It was the gathering place for an important small Irish Catholic community for many, many years. But about 4 or 5 years ago, a couple teenagers broke in, and whether accidentally or not, I'm not quite sure, but they set the church on fire and the whole thing burned to the ground. It was a total loss. All that was left was the stone steps and, oddly enough, the plaque noting its National Register status. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, there are a variety of serious challenges facing churches in the state today that we need to consider when thinking about how to preserve these properties and what we can do with them going forward. That concludes the church one. And now we'll turn around and go to mail pouch tobacco barns, which were, well, still are, an iconic landmark on the rural American countryside. Next slide, please. So the chew mail pouch tobacco barns were the invention of the Block Brothers Tobacco Company of Wheeling and its successor organizations. This was the company that invented and marketed mail pouch tobacco, and they came up with a very creative way to advertise it by painting signs on barns on country roads across both this state and all around the Midwest and Eastern United States, parts of the South. Thousands were painted, possibly up to 20,000, although estimates vary because that count may also include repaintings of barns. The barn signs emerged, we believe, in the late 1800s and continued up to the early 1990s, but most were created between 1925 and 1969. And the barn sign painting program ended in 1993. While they were very common around the state and parts of the country for many, many years, their numbers are plummeting extremely fast these days. Through our office's research, we've confirmed about 60 still stand today in the state, a very small percentage of what historically was there. You know, there were several hundred in West Virginia at its peak, and we're losing more each year. The majority of mail pouch barns are eligible to be put on the National Register, and thanks to initiatives started by our office, we've gotten 3 put on the National Register in the past year, and there's a 4th one listed too in Mason County. So next slide. An interesting fact about the mail pouch barns is that they were painted by a very small group of specialty artists who would, they were hired as contractors by the Block Brothers to travel across the country in trucks and talk to farmers and pay to rent their barn signs and paint the advertisements on the sides of their barns. Barns proved to be a very ideal makeshift billboard throughout agricultural areas. Probably the most prominent mail pouch barn painter was Harley Warwick, seen here in the pictures. He painted barns from the 1940s up until 1993 when he retired. And for the last 30 years of the program, he was the only mail pouch barn painter left. He would go paint or repaint all these barns solo. So probably all or most of the mail pouch barns that survive today were painted by him, thanks to his work. So the barns that we have today are a reflection of his craftsmanship, and that only adds to the historic significance of these mail pouch barns. Next slide. And the condition of mail pouch barns varies widely today. Often it depends solely on the property owner and how much care they take in maintaining the barns. The one on the left is the Hutchinson Parsons Folk Mail Pouch Barn in Jackson County. And the owners there are pretty good about maintaining the barn. They've paid to have it repainted several times over the past 30 years. So it's in great shape, maintains its historic integrity. And it's probably the best conditioned mail pouch barn in the state, maybe the nation too. I'm not quite sure. And then the one on the right is a barn that probably hasn't been painted since the last time Harley Warwick did it, probably 30 or 40 years ago. You can see how it's pretty faded. You can't tell the yellow from the white in the font anymore. It's overgrown. You've got wood warping. A plank is missing on the middle. And that's unfortunately the condition of most of our surviving mail pouch barns. Next slide. So what are the causes of mail pouch barn deterioration? The biggest problem was the discontinuation of the barn painting program. Once Harley Warwick retired in 1993, the tobacco company chose not to hire a new person to paint the barns. It just wasn't worth it for them anymore. And tobacco advertising on billboards is a bit of a no-no these days. So with the program ended, it was left up to property owners to maintain the barns, and most of them haven't for various reasons. Painting is expensive, especially if you want to make sure you get the colors and the font size and shape historically accurate. You need a specialized painter for that, not just anyone, and that only increased the costs. A lot of property owners just aren't interested in maintaining the barns for whatever reason. A lot of barns have been lost in conjunction with the loss of farmland and the decline of farming in general. You know, as farms are sold off and subdivided into housing, the barns are often demolished or left to sit and deteriorate, like the barn in the picture here. And that's a sad case. I talked to the owner a couple years ago. He purchased this land about 30 years ago with the barn on it, and he wasn't interested in keeping up the barn. And he told me quite candidly that he didn't care if it would fall down tomorrow. He had no plans to do anything about it. And then a little bit of anti-tobacco sentiment might also be a factor in why the barn signs aren't maintained. You know, tobacco is seen much more as a public health hazard today than it was half a century ago. And a lot of people think it's not a good thing to be advertising tobacco in public on public transportation routes. And, you know, that's a valid argument. Do I have another slide? No, I do not. So that's the deal with churches and tobacco barns.
Thank you so much, Cody. You know, I've also, just a quick comment as I'm getting this, I've seen some that have been redone that are more so like promoting healthy lifestyle. Like there was one about like cancer surviving. And so that was an interesting twist, I thought, on how that's
Yeah.
been adapted a little. But okay, so we have one more presenter, and I will be handing it off to Janice. So there you go, Janice. Take it away. Thank you. Oh, I think you're still muted. Sorry, I might have muted you earlier if there was
Yes,
some background.
there you go. All
I
right,
hear you
thank you,
good now.
Danielle. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Janice Cooley. I'm with the Greenbrier Historical Society in Lewisburg. And my presentation is a little different. We are recognizing and celebrating the preservations of buildings as well as the significant history of a region here, and that's Western Greenbrier County. So I'll talk to you a little bit about this project that has been in place for about 2 years now. Next slide, please. So the overall purpose of the project is to showcase and preserve the history of the coal mining, timber, and railroad industries in western Greenbrier County and the people who made it happen. We began this project because we felt that those industries were so significant in the western part of our county during the early 20th century. And a lot of that history had been lost, and the significance of those industries, and most importantly, the people who made those industries successful had been lost. And we wanted to, again, go back and highlight that history and the people in those industries. Next slide. Why are we doing this? To foster pride of the place in the community members, and again to make the individuals there in the region as well as across the state aware of the significance of that area as part of our history, and also to really impact the youth in the community and get them involved as much as we could with this project. Again, to highlight the contributions of the industries and what they did during that period, and of course, increase tourism and economic development. This area of Greenbrier County kind of sits around the border near the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve area, which has become a significant state park over the last few years. And we would like to think that by bringing and highlighting the history of that area through an exhibit that I'll talk a little bit about, will bring some of those tourists into that area and impact the economic development of that area. And of course, to preserve historic buildings and their history. Next slide, please. So in doing that, part of the history, we have been collecting oral histories. We felt it's important, as I said earlier, we wanted to highlight the people that made those industries successful. And so we've done approximately 50 oral histories with videos of the individuals. And we've gone into the different townships that were part of western Greenbrier County, the different coal mining and timbering townships, which there were many in that area, and met with these individuals to learn about their lifestyles, where their ancestors came from, where if some of them were older, they themselves had actually worked within the coal, timber, or railroad industry. So we thought it was very valuable to collect these histories. We also engaged students from Western Greenbrier High School to also interview individuals in the community. And these oral histories will be presented to the public in a museum site that we are, as we speak, putting together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. Part of our collection and in this museum will be photographs that we've collected of that period. The small towns, as I mentioned before, there were multiple towns, Rainell, Leslie, Charmco. There were many small mining towns and lumbering towns. And so we will be collecting photographs of buildings and homes that were part of that area. We want to show the lifestyles of the people, not only the workers that were part of those industries, but what it was like for their families to live in that area. What was it like for their children to go to school, to go to church? And we will be, again, highlighting that in our exhibit. So we've been collecting photographs from individuals. We've collected photographs from our archives at the Culture Center in Charleston. at the state capitol, and we've been able to get some very, very valuable photographs that we will use in our exhibit. Next slide, please. In addition to the photographs and the oral histories, of course, we've come across a lot of artifacts and memorabilia that will also be part of our museum or exhibit. And you can see just some of just very few of the many that we have collected. You can see at the bottom of this page some of the script that was used in the coal towns or coal mining towns where the employees were paid with script. And so we've been able to collect some of those kinds of artifacts. We actually had a project too in the schools where we had students actually do a presentation on script and how the members of the community used it, and how the things that they actually bought with the script. Next slide. So as I just said, we did go into the classroom. Part of this hidden history project was to develop a curriculum that we took into the classroom. We wanted to educate the students in the 4th grades, 8th grades, and 11th grades about the history of Western Greenbrier County and the history of those industries. And again, as I've said before, we wanted the students to really be familiar with not just the industries, but the people that made those industries successful, which were perhaps some of their ancestors, their grandparents. And we had an opportunity to go inside the classrooms, and our 4th graders that we really did, we were able to go into all the 4th grade classes in Greenbrier County, and we spoke to about 250 4th graders who learned about the industries, who taught us a lot about Greenbrier County and their lives and their expectation, but they were very, very excited about learning about these industries. And how we did that, we would do about an hour presentation inside the classroom where we talked about how those industries got started in Greenbrier County. We went back as far as how Native Americans first settled into the area, and then eventually how the early settlers came into our community from different parts of the world to actually work in the coal and timber industry. Immigrants that came in from Italy, Germany, England, African Americans that came up from the southern parts of the United States to work into these industries. So all of that was part of the presentation that we talked to the students about inside the classroom. How coal is made. A lot of the students drew maps of the entire county, Greenbrier County, and we learned how Western and Eastern Greenbrier County, due to the landscape, was the reason that there was significant coal in the western part of the county as opposed to the eastern part of the county. More mountainous being in the western part of the county, and therefore we talked about the coal and the amount of time that it took for that coal to be developed. So all of those things were interesting facts for the students. Next slide, please. So you might say, well, I've said a little bit about the exhibit space or museum. Well, we've actually have 2 buildings at this point that were given to the Greenbrier Historical Society. The one on the left is called the Mariluco Building, and this building was from the Meadow River Lumber Company, and that was the largest hardwood lumber company in the world. That was located in Rainelle, and that was the very, very huge large lumber company downtown Raynell. And this building on the left was a small building that the lumber company put on the fairground, the West Virginia State Fairground in Fairleigh, West Virginia, back in 1920. And it was meant for to actually highlight their business, to highlight the type of wood, the walnut, the hickory, the types of wood that they used for housing, as well as other ways that wood was used. So that was the house that they built. Also, just a little information about the Meadow River Lumber Company. The wood that they produce was used throughout the world. You'll find wood in the Waldorf Astoria in New York City that came from the Meadow River Lumber Company in Raynell. You'll find Meadow River Lumber Company wood in the palaces in London. So it was a very prominent lumber company. This building was given to the Greenbrier Historical Society, and we will be relocating that building to Raynell in the next few months. That is our plans. And the building to your right is another small building that was also owned by the Meadow River Lumber Company. And it was used as a sales office and for that company. And that was donated to the Historical Society as well. So as we speak, we are in the process of moving these buildings to a site in downtown Raynell and putting those buildings together. Those buildings will be used to, again, highlight the history of that area through photographs and memorabilia. We want to have inside the building a actual theater, very, very small theater that individuals will be able to come and sit and view the through the videos, the history of the region, as well as listen to oral histories that we've collected from the people. So this is a project, again, that is alive and well as we speak. And we hope to be able this time next year to come back and report that these buildings have come together and this museum will be open in downtown Raynell. So that is the end of my presentation on the Hidden History Project in Western Greenbrier County.
Thank you so much, Janice, and to all of our presenters today. I just wanted to take a moment that if you are an architect, you can scan that QR code that I just put on the screen. Hopefully you guys can see that okay, and that will help you to log your continuing education credits. So, does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to unmute to ask questions, or you can put one in the chat.